This is Denji. This is me. This is Denji dressed like me. This is me dressed as Denji. This is Denji's dog. This is me dressed like me, and this is Denji dressed like Denji. We'll be drawing him today. This video is in response to numerous questions I've received over the years, namely, how do you draw? It's a common question for any artist, usually accompanied by the typical, lots of practice, and sometimes not well responses. I'd figured I'd give a more substantial answer, however, and offer you guys and gals a peek behind the curtain. So here it is. Not only my complete drawing process, but how I set out to draw the gnarliest Chainsaw Man poster in the world. Starting with several layers of sketches, I knew going into this piece I wanted to really convey Denji's ferocity. So I opted for a striking pose and more realistic approach to his overall design. You can see as I get started with my pen here that I'm not committed to the huge protruding spikes nestled among his saw blades, so in my redesign I chose to forego the spikes entirely and keep a grounded look to his weaponry. I've learned from past projects that when it comes to tracing over detailed references like weapons, it's best to skip the sketching phase altogether and go straight to inking, which is what I'm doing here. I took several of my own photographs of chainsaws at the angles I knew I'd need and brought them into Sketchbook for tracing. I also knew this would end up being one of my larger portraits, so I didn't want to hold back with details, a decision that paid off in the final piece. Despite my best efforts, the angle of the face blade didn't quite line up with my sketch, so I did have to warp and segment my tracing layer to accommodate. Luckily, I didn't lose much of the layer's fidelity while doing this, and it gave me a chance to accentuate some of the line weight along with the silhouette once everything was in place. I noticed the back line of Denji's visor grills didn't align, so I did go back to the sketch layers to draw a guideline so I could reconstruct those grills properly. This tends to happen especially with machinery, weaponry, or vehicles, which are commonly cited as the most difficult subjects to animate and often draw given their rigid shapes. I probably could have gotten away with leaving the visor as is, but once I noticed, it definitely began to bug me, and I knew I had to correct it for my own sanity. It also doesn't help that I originally sketched Denji with only 3 grill slots when he actually has 4, so if you're ever drawing him in the future, do make note of that. Flipping your canvas is a great tip I learned only recently, and here you can see it served me greatly when I discovered yet another visor issue, that being the grills on the far side of his head being too low for the perspective I was drawing at. I made my final touch-ups to the saw blade and trimmed the line art around it before merging the 2 layers together. I've definitely caused myself trouble in the past by failing to trim surrounding line art and then merging 2 incongruent sections atop of each other, which can create rather ugly tangents if not straight up overwriting your previous work. You can see here I did miss trimming a little bit and had to redraw part of the chain. Now, even though this is still just my first ink pass and I don't normally add any line weight or block out my shadows, I did thicken and scrub over some blade details for the sake of coloring, which we'll get to in a bit. I went a little overboard with the details while drawing Denji's arm, probably because I got excited about drawing veins and fingers. Hands are, unironically, one of my favorite things to draw, especially when I have good reference, but this is still a first pass, so I risked complicating my coloring process, since this layer is used to select my flats. You'll notice here on a separate layer for the second saw blade, I do trace over Denji's hand. This is because I knew I wanted to widen the blade's guide bar compared to the reference images I took, so I left myself some extra material to work with. And once the position looks good, I erase the extra and thicken that silhouette again. You'll see I go back to messing around with potentially adding the spikes along the saw blades, at least for the forearms, before copying the chain I've already traced and moving on to what's probably my favorite part of the poster, that being the blades just starting to emerge from Denji's other arm. And here I do compromise on the decision to add spikes or stay realistic, and decide to go for both with a bit of edgy exaggeration for the topmost plates. I'm not going to lie, adding the stretching and yet torn skin around the burgeoning blades was one of the most disgusting and yet somehow satisfying parts of the whole piece. And now begins our second pass. A tedious but nevertheless necessary step, here I go over the entire canvas on another layer and block out my hard shading and textures. I do this on a separate layer so as not to overcomplicate the coloring process, and it allows me to render the artwork like a contemporary comic page, with all that harsh lighting and classic shading technique that I love so much. Shameless plug number 1. If you haven't guessed based on the advertisement footer and some random doodles scattered throughout the time-lapse, this artwork was drawn live on Twitch. I do my best to go live whenever it comes time to draw, so if you want to see that for yourself, you can join us Tuesdays and Thursdays for those special occasions. Shameless plug number 2. Here I use a custom chain brush from my personal brush pack, which I end up using to shade the tendons in Denji's neck, as well as several background elements. And if you're a fellow Autodesk Sketchbook user, you can pick this pack up for yourself or over on Gumroad. All links down below, of course. Alright then, back to the poster. Denji was looking a little chicken-legged, so I adjusted the line art to match the perspective. You'll also see I frequently drop the opacity of my second pass so that I can determine how best to complement the line art and find which shapes work best within it. Along the jaw, I really wanted to achieve a burnished metal look in the texturing, so this is one of the few times I switched to a painter's brush to match that effect. Here you see me making use of those custom chain brushes for the neck tendons. I wasn't sure how this would look in the final product, but once everything came together, it ended up being one of my favorite details. I couldn't figure out how much shading to block out on the neck. Initially, I wanted to preserve as much complexity in the tendrils as I could, but I realized this detracted from the attention you give to Denji's face, which is the centerpiece of the composition, so I was constantly painting over my line art to ensure a viewer's eye didn't linger too long on his neck. I definitely spent way too long on trying to find the perfect balance of light and dark, and should have just left this for when it came time to color and render. A mistake I made sure to learn from. Moving on from the face, I began adding strokes to the rest of the body. At first I wanted to go overboard, like with his head and saw blades, but I decided most of the shading, especially on the shirt, would benefit most from soft atmospheric lighting and less hard contrast, so I held myself back while finishing up the second pass. And now on to masking and flats. I find this brief step one of the most satisfying. By selecting the area around my line art and inverting the selection, I get a nice clean mask under the whole drawing, which is necessary for future clipping masks where we do full body lighting, shading, and silhouetting. I always choose a dark color for the base mask to help conceal any coloring gaps between the line art and flats, and it makes coloring easier if I can match the mask color to the character's overall color scheme or a particular color on their person. In this case, I experimented with shades of blue and green for Denji's pants before deciding to go with a straightforward gray, since I knew I could also use that color for the base of the chainsaws. Flats, or flat colors, are the unshaded portion of hue underlying all rendering. I get my flat shapes just by area selecting within my line art, which is why making sure I have uncluttered line art is so important on that first ink pass, and why I do my hard shading and texturing on another layer. Even so, you can see me going back with the lasso tool and cleaning up my selected areas before filling it in with the bucket. At this point, it's not uncommon for me to bounce between steps, like going back to clean up my second pass and line art when I've realized it'll cause problems for coloring and rendering. Now, here I struggled with what I consider to be one of the hardest aspects of illustrating a character redesign, that being the color choice for details that don't exist in the original image. The lip and border around the mouth here aren't elements present in Denji's manga or anime design, so I had to find a color that highlighted those new elements without clashing against all of the other colors in the scheme. This can be pretty challenging at times, and those of you who have heard about my Ruby redesigns, especially Pyrrha Nikos, know this was a significant problem I faced with that project as well. The other important note about color schemes is that less is more. Using fewer colors throughout the illustration helps with cohesiveness, an example of which you can see when I reused the maroon in the neck tendrils for the ripcord string. Afterwards, I sketched in several blood elements to help give an idea of what the final image might look like. I knew I wanted to do two variations of this design, one with and one without blood, so while this layer didn't end up in either of the final renders, it did serve as a groundwork for me to base my rendering decisions around. Speaking of which, now begins our final step, rendering. Before we even touch Denji, however, we need to go in and get our background set up. I've gotten into the habit of doing this, so I know the exact hue I need for atmospheric shadows and bounce light, the two things that really bring the whole piece together and sell the realism. Going with a bluish green to contrast the orange of Denji's face, I used custom chains again to quickly add in some background details. Okay, now on to Denji. If you've seen me draw before, you know that I love my cotton ball brush to quickly get some gritty texture down. Between that and your standard airbrush, I layered down various shades of sky blue and green, getting darker in creases and folds to mimic some ambient occlusion. The lasso tool also comes in clutch here to help illustrate hard lines and folds in the shirt. Despite that, I wasn't as precise with my selections as I should have been, so you can see that I do clean up the texture that spilled over onto the skin flats. That's a weird sentence. Anyway, while I do use a soft eraser to feather out and lighten some areas, keep in mind that this is all still on the same layer and we're only adding or subtracting shadow on top of the flats, so you can see how far even a little bit of shading can go. Now we move on to what's arguably the hardest part of any portrait, skin. While I'm not exempt from the inherent difficulty, I enjoy this part of the process because it allows for so much experimentation. Compared to my other works, I took a very different approach and drew a lighting map, that is, a flat indication of where the bulk of the shadows and highlights will appear, which helps prevent any banding by random brush strokes. My guidelines ended up looking a lot like traditional cell shading this time around, which tempted me to draw another variation of Denji, just totally cell shaded, but no, I had to stay focused. Can't lose sight of the finish line now. If you want me to go back and render a cell shaded variant though, let me know, I'm still kinda tempted to do so. Unlike the rest of the piece, I do all shading and lighting for the skin on a single layer. That way it's easy to keep everything I need in one place, and it also allows me to quickly overwrite and blend different strokes, which happens a lot. I make sure to add plenty of blush as well, since I knew Genji's skin along with his head was really the only warm color throughout the composition, and therefore would naturally attract the eye. I know many artists prefer the round brush when it comes to skin, looking at you, Rostran, but I do all of my rendering with the airbrush and add highlights with a custom freckle brush at the end. I do actually love the round brush and I've been using it a lot more lately, please don't hurt me. Moving on to the main attraction, I stretched some texture over the facial saw to match the perspective and began with the face. The color I used for shading was much darker and nearly red compared to the straight up orange of the base flat, which I didn't expect to have to draw with to get the result I wanted, but after a bit of messing around with the layers mode and opacity, I eventually settled on this muddled burn effect, which gives me a lot of wiggle room in case I want to mess with it later. Rendering his smile was so much fun. I haven't drawn teeth in a long time, and they have some very unique properties, like a slight transparency by the tip. You'll notice I actually cut out the hard shading of the smile and paste it on another layer to minimize the opacity so that I can focus on those aforementioned fun colors. I'll be honest, I don't think I've had this many layers dedicated to line art before. I spent way more time on Genji's chest than I thought I'd have to. I kept finding myself working around the sternum line, and honestly, I should have just erased it and airbrushed the whole chest, but I didn't want to leave such a huge portion of the piece without any line art, even if it was painted over. Eventually, I worked around my stubbornness and painted something decent, so I moved on. I felt a strange sense of responsibility to draw the fingernails well, because I don't know if you guys and gals noticed, but in the anime, everyone's fingernails have like 3 or 4 color passes on them, which is an unnecessary level of detail. Mappa, why is there this much detail? Seriously. Anyway, I felt like I had a duty to live up to the precedent that the studio set. Can't lie, the banding on the knuckles of the outstretched hand was horrendous, so I made sure to fix that. This is also when I disabled the blood layer to have a clearer silhouette of Denji's arm. Now on to lighting. Starting with the head, since I knew I wanted a stark top-down light, I used a similar color burn effect as the shading, this time to up the contrast and give the shell a more metallic texture and reflectiveness. I'm pretty sure I painted on the same layer for the shirt because I liked the contrast, and continued using my soft eraser to feather those edges. I changed the color to the background green and upped the value for bounce light, which I applied under his raised arm and along the edges of the pants. Now we move on to final compositing. This is another favorite practice of mine to help bring everything together cohesively, and it starts with mimicking some lens overexposure on his head and shirt. I got to go all out with my airbrush, which was a ton of fun, and this not only adds a realistic effect, but also softens some of the line art. Highlights. Everyone's favorite detail. You can see me now going over the skin with that freckle brush I mentioned earlier, using pure white to highlight his pores and sweat. After that, I go up to his eye to add some depth to his iris, a sharp highlight, and reflectiveness along the waterline and lacrimal caruncle. I also swapped back to the lighting layer to add some specks to the metal. On to final effects, and this is one of my favorite elements. I selected the area of Denji's face behind the saw blade to paint a yellowish glow, as I'd imagine you'd see from his undamaged eye. Fun to draw, but my initial selection wasn't the cleanest, so you can see I had to brush up between the saw teeth. A little color dodge never hurt anybody, and I added some lighting effects to the background to help sell the top lighting. I also increased the contrast by the bottom of the frame to help draw the eye upwards to Denji's face. And that concludes our illustration of Chainsaw Man, at least the Safe for Life version. I added several elements off screen, like the border frame and Denji's reflection in his own saw blade, and what you're watching now is a separate stream a week later when I came back to draw the, well, not Safe for Life version. Now, normally I'd sketch and ink where the blood would go and fill and render it in like any other element, but I decided to go the experimental route again. Similar to a light map, I drew guidelines for where the blood and spittle would coalesce and drip from Denji's body, then selected those areas in rough teardrop and splatter shapes to fill in with a crimson base, which I then dropped the opacity of. You'll notice I used the rule of threes throughout this process. Typically, for shape economy, you want to have a small, a medium, and a large shape grouped together. I did the same thing here, only with groups of short, long, and very long strands of spittle and liquid. This helps organize what's otherwise a pretty naturally chaotic element, and helps keep the viewer's eye from getting too overwhelmed. I also copied my hard shading layer above my blood flats to keep the blood from looking like it was painted over an already finished piece, since, well, that's exactly what it was. A quick shading and lighting pass, and after some highlights I thought I'd be done. It still looked really flat, however, so I grabbed my ink pen and blocked in shadows to make the blood feel like it was really clinging to crevices and folds. I just traced my line art from below, and after some bounce light I was much happier with the results. If there's anything I learned from this poster, it's that I'm seriously out of shape when it comes to drawing blood. I thought bruises would make a good addition, especially around where the saw blades emerge, so a few brushes of purple and yellow, and ta-da, he's all banged up. Speaking of bruises and blood, I forgot to add veins around the original piece, so I made sure to go around with blue and maroon and give the skin some extra depth. And finally, since we'd come this far anyway, I added splotches and stains to Denji's clothes. I have several good brushes for this, most of which come with Sketchbook by default, and they don't see the light of day nearly often enough, so it felt nice to bring them out. Side note, never underestimate your pencil tool. I use it all the time for texture, like here, where it was perfect for drawing strands of cloth that have been extra soaked in gobbledygook. A few final details and voila! Our Not Safe for Life Chainsaw Man poster is finally complete. All in all, illustrating both versions of this poster took me about 8 hours, nearly all of which were streamed live over on Twitch. If you dig these designs as much as I do, you can head over to my website or Etsy store where both posters are available to purchase in their full 4K glory. And if you've made it all the way to the end of this video, thank you. I know several of you have been requesting a video like this for a while, and I hope it finally answers all, or at least most of your questions regarding my process and design philosophy. We're live on Twitch with new artwork and commentary every Tuesday and Thursday. You can subscribe right here so that, YouTube. And you can join our Discord for more exclusive content and promo codes for our store items. Until next time, I've been Gyro, you've been amazing, and I appreciate your support like you would not believe. God bless you.